Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from, and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1837, when a notice appeared in the Beaufort County Courthouse records, a simple entry that would become one of the most debated cases in antebellum legal history. Overseer Thaddeus Whitmore, age 34, hand severed at the wrist by animal attack. Witnesses present. The detail that made this entry remarkable was not the violence itself, but what the witness testimonies revealed. The animal in question was a dog named Old Caesar, and he had reportedly attacked, in defense of his master, a slave named Moses, creating a legal paradox that exposed the darkest contradictions of the peculiar institution. The depositions taken in the 3 days following the incident on April 17th paint a picture of the Ashford Plantation, a sprawling 2,400-acre estate where Colonel Marcus Ashford maintained absolute authority over nearly 300 enslaved individuals through a system of calculated brutality that had made his plantation among the most profitable in the Low Country. The witnesses summoned to provide testimony included 7 enslaved workers, 2 white overseers, the plantation physician, and a cotton merchant who had been visiting the property that morning, each offering accounts that aligned in their description of the attack's ferocity, but diverged dramatically when recounting the moments that preceded it. Some witnesses testified that the dog had attacked without provocation, launching itself at Whitmore as he conducted routine inspection of the forge where Moses labored as the plantation's primary blacksmith. Others, however, described a confrontation between overseer and enslaved man, a verbal exchange that escalated before Old Caesar intervened with a violence that seemed, in their words, almost deliberate in its precision and sustained in its execution, as though the animal possessed an understanding of injustice that transcended mere instinct. Moses had been born on the Ashford Plantation in 1809, the son of a field hand named Sarah and a father whose name was never recorded in any ledger or document, trained from the age of 12 in the blacksmith's trade under the supervision of an elderly enslaved craftsman who passed away when Moses was 19, leaving him as the sole blacksmith responsible for maintaining the tools, chains, and iron implements that kept the plantation's brutal machinery of cotton production functioning without interruption. The plantation ledger from 1835, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives and examined by researchers in 1973, lists Moses's appraised value at $1,200, a sum that reflected his specialized skills and the reality that a competent blacksmith was worth more than 4 field hands, combined in the calculations of human property that defined the antebellum economy. The relationship between Moses and Old Caesar began in the spring of 1832, when Moses discovered a puppy, barely weaned and near death from starvation, abandoned by the riverbank where the enslaved workers sometimes gathered during the brief respite of Sunday afternoons. Multiple witnesses in their 1837 depositions recalled that Moses had nursed the animal back to health, feeding him scraps from his own meager rations, and that from that point forward, the dog had remained constantly at the blacksmith's side, sleeping in the forge where the heat from banked coals provided warmth through the cold low-country winters. What made this arrangement unusual, as noted by the plantation overseer in his monthly reports to Colonel Ashford, was that unlike the hunting dogs and tracking hounds kept by the plantation to pursue runaways through the swamps, Old Caesar had never been trained for any purpose beyond companionship, never wore a collar, never was chained, and yet never wandered beyond the immediate vicinity of wherever Moses worked. The plantation ledger, meticulous in its accounting of every asset down to the chickens in the yard, contained no entry for Old Caesar, no assigned monetary value, as though the dog existed in a category that the rigid systems of property classification could not accommodate. The morning of April 17, 1837, began as countless others had on the Ashford plantation, with Moses arriving at the forge before dawn to stoke the fires and begin work on the repair of plough blades damaged during the previous week's work in the fields. His routine documented by multiple witnesses who testified that nothing in his demeanor suggested he anticipated the events that would unfold before the sun reached its zenith. Thaddeus Whitmore appeared at the forge approximately 3 hours after sunrise, his arrival noted by the plantation carpenter working in an adjacent shed, and immediately accused Moses of stealing or hiding 3 iron chisels and a hammer that were listed in the forge's tool inventory, implements that Whitmore claimed had been reported missing during his morning inspection. What none of the witnesses present that day could have known, and what would not be revealed until the discovery of Whitmore's journal more than a century later, was that the overseer had removed these tools himself the previous evening and concealed them in the feed storage barn, an act of deliberate provocation recorded in his journal entry from that morning, where he wrote that he had created an opportunity to administer the correction that the blacksmith's prideful nature required. The confrontation escalated when Moses reportedly stated that he had not taken the tools and did not know their location, a response that witnesses described as delivered in a calm, measured tone, without any hint of insubordination. Yet Whitmore interpreted this as defiance, and drew the braided leather whip that all overseers carried as the symbol and instrument of their authority. The exact sequence of events that followed varies across the 7 depositions taken from enslaved witnesses and the 3 accounts provided by white observers, with some testifying that Whitmore struck Moses across the face before the dog reacted, while others claimed the whip was merely raised in a threatening gesture. But every witness agreed without exception on what happened next. Old Caesar, who had been lying quietly in the corner of the forge, as was his custom, launched himself at the overseer with a ferocity that seemed to transcend animal instinct and approach something closer to deliberate vengeance. Dr. Silas Pemberton, who had served as physician to the Ashford plantation for nearly 15 years, and whose medical records survive in remarkable detail at the Medical University of South Carolina archives, provided testimony that described the injury with clinical precision that makes the violence of the attack undeniable even across the distance of centuries. The overseer's right hand had been severed completely at the wrist joint, not through a clean cut, but through crushing force that shattered the radius and ulnar bones into fragments, the tissue torn rather than sliced, suggesting that the dog had bitten down and then twisted or shaken its head with tremendous force, a mechanism of injury that Dr. Pemberton noted was consistent with predatory animals killing prey rather than defensive bites, meant merely to warn or deter. What made the incident even more remarkable, and what appears in 5 of the 7 depositions provided by enslaved witnesses, with a consistency that suggests accuracy rather than coordinated fabrication, was that old Caesar maintained his grip on Whitmore's wrist even as the overseer screamed and struck at the animal with his free hand, refusing to release, until Moses spoke a single word, the specific command varying in the testimonies between enough and stop and release, but the essential fact remaining constant. The dog obeyed the enslaved man's voice. This detail created the central paradox that would haunt the legal proceedings that almost followed, the image of a slave giving commands that were instantly obeyed while the white overseer lay helpless, bleeding into the dirt of the forge floor, his authority literally severed from his body. The plantation bell rang within minutes, its urgent clanging summoning every person on the property to witness the aftermath, and Whitmore was carried to the main house where Dr. Pemberton examined the severed hand, still clutching the whip handle, and declared that reattachment was impossible given the extent of the crushing damage and the time that had elapsed since the injury occurred. Colonel Marcus Ashford found himself confronting a legal and social dilemma that had no clear precedent in South Carolina law or custom, a situation made more complex by the fact that his valuable blacksmith remained unharmed while his overseer had been permanently maimed, creating economic calculations that competed with the demands of racial hierarchy and the unwritten codes that governed relations between white authority and enslaved populations. The law seemed clear on the surface. Any animal that attacked a white person, particularly one that caused serious injury, must be destroyed immediately as both punishment and deterrent, a principle that had been applied countless times across the South when dogs bit overseers, livestock gored plantation owners, or horses threw their riders. However, multiple witnesses, including 2 white men whose testimony could not be easily dismissed, insisted that the dog had acted in defense of Moses against what they characterized as imminent violence from Whitmore, introducing a complicating factor that made the application of standard legal remedies problematic. The question that emerged from this situation, one that struck at the philosophical foundations of the slave system itself, was whether an enslaved man could be said to own property, even something as seemingly insignificant as a dog, and if so, whether that property could exercise rights of defense that the enslaved man himself didn't legally possess. County Sheriff William Bradford's correspondence with the State Attorney General, discovered in 1978 among papers donated to the South Carolina Department of Archives, reveals the extent of the confusion this case generated among legal authorities, who recognized that any decision would create precedent with implications that extended far beyond one plantation. Colonel Ashford consulted with 3 different attorneys over the course of 2 weeks, receiving contradictory opinions that ranged from immediate destruction of both dog and enslaved man as a deterrent to others, to argument that no crime had been committed, since slaves could not commit crimes against white men, and animals acted only on instinct without legal culpability, to the suggestion that the matter should be quietly resolved through financial compensation to avoid the complications of formal legal proceedings. The depositions taken between April 18th and April 20th, 1837, represent a remarkable collection of testimony that included 7 enslaved workers brought before the county magistrate to provide sworn statements, an unusual occurrence given that slave testimony was generally inadmissible in court proceedings, except in cases where no white witnesses existed or where the testimony served the interests of white property owners seeking to establish facts relevant to their own legal claims. What makes these depositions particularly significant is the consistency of the accounts provided by witnesses who had no opportunity to coordinate their stories, each describing the same sequence of events with variations only in minor details of perspective and distance from the incident itself. All 7 enslaved witnesses testified that Thaddeus Whitmore had struck Moses across the face with his open hand before, drawing his whip, that Moses had not responded with violence or even verbal protest, and that old Caesar had attacked only after this physical blow was delivered, launching himself at the overseer with what one witness described as focused rage, rather than the wild frenzy typical of animal aggression. The testimony of the 2 white witnesses, Samuel Garrett, the plantation carpenter whose workshop stood adjacent to the forge, and Thomas Wickham, a cotton merchant from Charleston, who had been conducting business with Colonel Ashford that morning and had wandered toward the forge out of idle curiosity, corroborated these accounts in their essential details, though both men emphasized in their depositions that they could not speak to the overseer's intentions or whether Moses had committed some earlier offense that justified the physical correction. The depositions also revealed a pattern that had gone previously unnoticed, or at least unremarked. 3 witnesses testified that old Caesar had growled at Whitmore on at least 4 separate occasions over the preceding 6 months, behavior that Moses had immediately corrected with a quiet word that silenced the animal, suggesting that the dog possessed an instinctive hostility toward the overseer that Moses himself never expressed through word or action, as though the animal perceived a threat that the enslaved man could not afford to acknowledge. A letter written by Colonel Marcus Ashford to his younger brother Jonathan, a rice planter in Charleston, dated May 3, 1837, and discovered in 2003 among family papers during the estate sale of an Ashford descendant, provides insight into the questions and anxieties that the incident generated among the planting class, who saw in this case implications that extended far beyond the injury to a single overseer. The letter addresses rumors that had begun circulating through the interconnected network of plantation owners who communicated regularly about matters of mutual concern, whispers suggesting that Moses had deliberately trained old Caesar to serve as his protector, teaching the animal to recognize threats and to respond with violence when Moses himself could not act without inviting lethal punishment. Colonel Ashford expressed skepticism about these rumors in his letter, noting that he had never observed Moses engaging in any systematic training of the animal beyond basic commands to stay or follow, and that the dog's attack seemed more likely to have been a spontaneous reaction to witnessing violence against a person the animal had bonded with, rather than the execution of some premeditated plan. However, the letter also reveals Ashford's deeper unease with the entire situation, his recognition that if the rumors were true, if an enslaved man had indeed created his own instrument of resistance and protection, then it represented a form of agency and forethought that the entire system of slavery depended on denying was possible, a demonstration that enslaved people could plan, could prepare, could find ways to resist the absolute power that owners claimed to possess over their human property. The letter's final paragraphs discuss conversations Ashford had with neighboring plantation owners at a dinner party, revealing that the case was being closely watched throughout the Low Country as planters waited to see how it would be resolved, concerned that any precedent suggesting that enslaved people had the right to defend themselves, even through proxy, might encourage resistance and undermine the psychological foundations of terror and helplessness upon which the institution rested. Dr. Silas Pemberton's medical notes, meticulously preserved in the South Carolina Medical College archives and spanning the 6 weeks following the attack, document Thaddeus Whitmore's physical recovery in clinical detail that contrasts sharply with the psychological deterioration that the overseer's own journal entries from this period reveal with disturbing clarity. The physical wounds healed as well as could be expected, given the severity of the injury, the severed wrist cauterized and bandaged, the risk of infection managed through regular application of carbolic solutions. But Whitmore emerged from his convalescence fundamentally altered, not merely by the loss of his dominant hand, but by the rage and humiliation that the circumstances of that loss had inflicted upon his sense of identity and authority. His journal entries from May and June of 1837, written in the awkward scrawl of his untrained left hand, reveal an obsession with revenge that grew more elaborate and vindictive with each passing week, pages filled with detailed fantasies of how both Moses and old Caesar should be executed, proposals that ranged from public hanging to being torn apart by other dogs to being burned alive, punishments that Whitmore argued were necessary not merely for justice, but to send a message to every enslaved person in the county about the consequences of any resistance, even resistance by proxy through an animal. Whitmore presented his demands to Colonel Ashford repeatedly during May, insisting that both the dog and the blacksmith be destroyed immediately, threatening to bring formal charges if Ashford continued to delay, but the colonel resisted these demands with arguments that had nothing to do with mercy or moral consideration, and everything to do with economic calculation and social strategy. Moses represented a significant investment, $1,200 of property that could not be casually destroyed to satisfy an overseer's wounded pride, and the incident had already generated more attention than Ashford desired, with neighboring plantation owners watching to see how he would handle a situation that had no comfortable resolution within the existing frameworks of law and custom. The formal hearing that county officials initially planned to convene regarding the incident at Ashford Plantation was drafted in preliminary form during the last week of April 1837, with notices prepared to summon witnesses and establish a date for proceedings. But these plans never progressed beyond the bureaucratic stage of document preparation, as court records preserved in the Beaufort County Courthouse archives demonstrate through a series of postponement notices that pushed the hearing first to May, then to June, then to an unspecified future date before the matter disappeared entirely from the official docket without any recorded resolution or conclusion. The only contemporary public reference to the case appears in the Charleston Mercury, a newspaper that served as the voice of the planting class throughout South Carolina, in an edition dated June 17, 1837, where a brief notice buried on the 5th page among advertisements and shipping news mentions that an overseer on a Beaufort County plantation had been injured by an animal attack, providing no names, no details of the circumstances, and no indication of the legal and philosophical questions that the incident had generated among those who understood its implications. What actually transpired to resolve the matter remained hidden from public record until 1989, when a researcher examining county clerk record books for an unrelated study discovered a notation in the margin of a page dated July 1837, written in a hand different from the clerk's official entries, stating simply that Colonel M. Ashford had paid compensation of $500 to T. Whitmore for injuries sustained, and that no further proceedings would be necessary. This private settlement, arranged through negotiations that left no paper trail beyond this single cryptic notation, allowed all parties to avoid the complications of a formal hearing that would have forced legal authorities to confront questions they had no interest in answering: whether enslaved people possessed any right to defend themselves, whether property owned by someone who was himself property could exercise agency, and whether the entire edifice of slavery could withstand close examination of its internal contradictions. Colonel Marcus Ashford concluded, despite having successfully avoided formal legal proceedings through financial settlement with Thaddeus Whitmore, that the continued presence of both Moses and old Caesar on his plantation represented an ongoing source of tension and potential disorder that could not be tolerated regardless of the economic value that the skilled blacksmith represented to his operations. The decision he reached by late July of 1837 was not to destroy either the enslaved man or the animal, but to separate them permanently, removing Moses from the plantation entirely through sale to a buyer far enough away that reunion would be impossible, and that the incident itself might fade from immediate memory among the remaining enslaved population. Estate records from August 1837, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives and examined by researchers documenting the internal slave trade that moved hundreds of thousands of people across state lines during the antebellum period, show that Moses was sold for $900 to a cotton planter named Hiram Vickery, whose holdings were located in Burke County, Georgia, approximately 150 miles from Beaufort. The bill of sale, a standard legal document of the type generated thousands of times each year, as enslaved people were bought and sold like any other commodity, lists Moses as a skilled blacksmith, age 28, of sound body and mind, guaranteed free from physical defects or tendencies toward running away, with no mention anywhere in the document of a dog or any other attachment that might complicate the transaction. Witnesses who remained on the Ashford plantation and whose testimony was recorded decades later during interviews conducted by researchers gathering oral histories of slavery stated that old Caesar howled continuously for 3 days after Moses was taken away in chains, the animal's cries audible across the entire plantation, refusing all food that was offered, and attempting repeatedly to follow the scent trail that Moses had left, behavior that eventually required that the dog be chained to a post near the forge to prevent him from running away toward Georgia in search of the person he recognized as master. The fate of old Caesar after Moses' departure represents the most obscure and contested element of this already fragmentary historical narrative, with 3 distinctly different accounts surviving in various archives and oral histories, each offering a version of events that cannot be reconciled with the others, leaving researchers to acknowledge that what actually happened to the dog may never be definitively established. The first account comes from an interview conducted in 1902 with a formerly enslaved woman named Rachel, who had been a child on the Ashford plantation in 1837 and who stated in her testimony, recorded as part of an early effort to preserve slave narratives, that old Caesar was shot approximately 2 weeks after Moses was sold, the execution carried out by one of the remaining overseers under direct orders from Colonel Ashford, and that the dog's body was buried in an unmarked location beyond the workers' quarters. The second account derives from the Ashford plantation records themselves, specifically a livestock inventory conducted in September of 1837, that notes old Caesar's presence in previous months, but marks him as disappeared with no further explanation, suggesting either that the dog ran away or died under circumstances that the plantation administration chose not to document officially. The third and most disturbing account emerges from a letter written in 1881 by Colonel Ashford's grandson to a cousin, discovered among family papers in the 1990s, which discusses the incident as family history, and states that his grandfather had ordered old Caesar to be chained without food or water as a deliberate lesson to the enslaved population about the consequences of any form of resistance, even resistance enacted through an animal, allowing the dog to die slowly over the course of a week while people were forced to witness his suffering, a calculated act of cruelty designed to erase any memory of the attack as a moment of successful defiance, and to replace it with an image of absolute power reasserted through methodical destruction. The historical record concerning Moses' life after his sale to Georgia remains almost completely silent for more than a century after 1837, until a remarkable discovery in 1967, when a graduate student researching Quaker abolitionist networks in the antebellum South found a diary kept by a man named Josiah Pemberton, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia who had traveled through Georgia in 1839 on business that also served as cover for his work, documenting the conditions of slavery for abolitionist publications in the North. The diary entry dated March 12, 1839, describes Pemberton's visit to a plantation in Burke County, where he observed the operations of a cotton gin and conversed briefly with several enslaved workers, including a blacksmith named Moses, who bore visible scars across his left cheek and who spoke with reluctance about his previous circumstances in South Carolina. Pemberton's account notes that Moses mentioned a dog he had once known, describing the animal in terms that suggested a relationship deeper than simple companionship, though the blacksmith declined to provide details about how they had been separated or what had become of the animal after their parting. The diary entry also records 2 specific observations that Pemberton found striking enough to document. First, that Moses refused to work with any of the tracking dogs kept by the plantation, showing visible distress when the animals were brought near the forge, and second, that Moses had carved a small wooden figure of a dog, roughly 3 inches in length, which he kept hidden in a leather pouch and which he would occasionally remove to hold during the brief moments when no overseers were present. The most revealing detail in Pemberton's account comes in a single sentence of reported speech, a statement that Moses made during their conversation when the Quaker asked whether he missed his former home in South Carolina, to which Moses reportedly replied, looking at the wooden figure in his palm, "That dog knew what free meant before I did." The story of old Caesar and Moses, though buried in official records and silenced through legal settlement and forced separation, survived and evolved through the oral traditions of enslaved communities across the South, transmitted through the networks of communication that existed beneath the surface of plantation life, carried by workers sold from one estate to another, whispered in the quarters during the few hours of darkness that belonged to enslaved people, themselves passed from parents to children as both cautionary tale and source of hope that resistance was possible even in the most constrained circumstances. By the time the Works Progress Administration conducted its extensive slave narrative project during the 1930s, interviewing thousands of formerly enslaved people in their old age, variations of the old Caesar story had spread across multiple states, with versions appearing in interviews conducted in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and as far west as Texas, each retelling shaped by the teller's own experiences and the particular needs of their community for stories that affirmed the possibility of defiance. In these later versions, old Caesar becomes more than a mere animal, transformed through the alchemy of oral tradition into a symbol of resistance that transcended the biological limitations of dogs and approached the realm of folk hero or trickster figure, with some accounts claiming the dog could understand human speech perfectly and even speak in return, while others suggested he was a spirit that had taken animal form specifically to protect Moses from the cruelties of Overseer Whitmore. Despite these supernatural embellishments that marked the story's evolution from historical incident to legend, what remained consistent across all versions was the central image that had made the original event so disturbing to the planting class: a dog that recognized injustice when it witnessed violence against someone it loved, and that refused to accept the social order which decreed that some humans could brutalize other humans with impunity, acting against that order with a clarity of purpose that the legal system could not accommodate without acknowledging the fundamental immorality of the entire institution it served. The case of old Caesar and Moses, buried in courthouse archives and silenced through private settlement, ultimately returns us to the central paradox that made the incident so dangerous to the legal and social foundations of antebellum South Carolina. If an enslaved man possessed no rights of property ownership, if he could not own tools or land, or even his own body, existing instead as property himself in the eyes of the law, then what meaning could be assigned to the undeniable fact that a dog had recognized Moses as master and had obeyed his commands, even in a moment of extreme violence? The single page that documents the incident in the Beaufort County Courthouse, preserved now behind archival glass and examined by historians seeking to understand the internal contradictions of slavery, captures in its spare legal language an impossibility that the system could not acknowledge without threatening its own foundations. A moment when the entire elaborate structure of laws and customs that reduced human beings to commodities revealed itself as fundamentally absurd. Modern historians who have studied the case note that old Caesar, in defending Moses from Overseer Whitmore's violence, created a situation where the logic of slavery became visible in its full incoherence, where a dog's instinctive recognition of relationship and loyalty exposed what the legal system had to deny in order to function, which was that enslaved people formed bonds of affection and command, that they were capable of inspiring devotion and exercising authority, that they were human beings whose fundamental nature could not be erased by the legal fictions that classified them as property. The case was not resolved through any principled legal decision, but rather buried through financial settlement and forced separation, hidden away, because to truly resolve it would have required acknowledging that enslaved people possessed the capacity for relationships, for loyalty, for love, recognitions that the law couldn't permit without dismantling the entire edifice of slavery itself. And so the question that old Caesar posed through his act of defense remains suspended in the historical record, unanswered and unanswerable within the system that generated it.